Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Arik Chowdhury. I'm Head of Policy for Data and Digital Technologies at the Royal Society. That's the UK's National Academy of Science, which I appreciate means absolutely nothing to most of you. It's the oldest scientific institution in the world. We're a fellowship of some of the world's leading scientists. And just building on the Elizabeth point earlier, I set a challenge with my colleague Nicole, who I think is somewhere up in the balcony, to leave with 5 LinkedIn contacts. And I'm going to cheat now and remind you at the beginning to please add me on LinkedIn, and very much also welcome any messages if you want to get in touch about any of our work. So we've got 25 minutes. We're going to look at the Online Safety Act, which is a massive piece of legislation that the UK government has just approved. And joining us today, we've got Fred Langford, Director of Trust and Safety Technology at Ofcom, Richard Wingfield, Director, Technology Sectors at Business for Social Responsibility, and Nicolas Suzor, who's a board member of the Oversight Board. And just to start with, I wanted to apologize profusely for this becoming a manual. It was due to some last-minute changes, but we will have an excellent conversation. So, I'm going to join. We've got about 25 minutes. Whoa, that was loud. Okay, we've got about 25 minutes. So I'm going to get straight to our questions, and I would ask the panel to be very succinct with their answers. And quick survey, who's heard of the Online Safety Bill, or who's familiar with it? Okay, well, in 25 minutes, you're about to learn a lot more about it. So, first question is, okay, in one sentence, or 1 minute, what do you consider to be the greatest strength of the Online Safety Act? And let's start this way. Also, if you could just briefly say a little bit more about your background as well.
Does that count as my sentence?
Yes, it does.
So my name's Nick Suzor. I'm a law professor from Brisbane, Australia, a member of the Oversight Board. We try to hold Meta accountable for human rights, content policies, and enforcement on its platforms, on Instagram and on Facebook. We've been around for about 3 years. It's an ongoing challenge. It's a cool experiment, and it's very hard. I'm impressed that the Act exists. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean that for a long time, it's been really hard, almost impossible, to regulate the internet, right? Like, it has been, governments have not really taken the time to actually understand the tech in a way that allows you to develop effective regulation. What we have needed for a long time is regulatory innovation. So it's cool that we are seeing now in the UK, in the EU and other places, different approaches, because I still think we have no idea how to do it, but let's find out.
Fred.
Yes, Fred Langford, Director of Trust and Safety Technology at Ofcom. So part of my role is obviously working around all of the aspects of the Online Safety Act. So I suppose for me, my prior life was working as the CTO and Deputy CEO of an organisation called the Internet Watch Foundation, which is very much a self-regulatory organisation trying to stop harm online. For me, the biggest benefit is now there is something to hold platforms to account over. It's not going to be perfect, and we'll get onto the next question, I'm sure, about what's not great about it. But it just means there is something there. And it's the start of a journey, and we're not going to get it right first time, I'm sure, and everybody will hold us to account on that. I'm also sure of that. But it just means that we've actually got the stick to be able to say, you're not doing good enough here. This is what is the expectation of the public, of the regulators, and how well are you doing? Let's measure against that and see how well you're moving, and keep nudging and making things better. It's not going to happen overnight. We haven't got that magic pill that Elizabeth was talking about. We can't just open the drawer and say that's going to be the solution to solve all these problems. It's just something that we've got now to be able to start working towards solving them.
Thanks. So I'm Richard Wingfield. I'm one of the directors at Business for Social Responsibility, and I work with tech companies, including some of the world's largest tech companies, on their human rights impacts. I think, and kind of coming back to what some of the previous panel were saying, I think one of the ways that the Online Safety Act will move things forward is it will, for the first time, force companies to think about the impacts of their products and services on people. And prior to regulatory expectations, the only thing that would really drive that would be commercial or reputational pressures, which many companies can withstand due to their size or the dominance that they might have in the space. So this will be the first time where they're now actually forced by regulation to think through what their impacts are against the different types of harm that the legislation outlines and to do something about it. And so we'll start to invest in the resources. But I'm more looking forward to the second question around the challenges with the legislation.
Well done keeping it succinct. I agree, it's amazing. So a few, maybe 6 years ago in a previous role, we were having this conversation about regulating social media platforms, and people would consider it bonkers that would ever happen. And so it is amazing to see that there is an Online Safety Act. But going on to question 2, in 1 sentence or 1 minute, what do you consider to be the greatest weakness of the Online Safety Act? And don't try and weasel out of it, Fred.
What's the polite word for vague? It leaves lots of room for development and adaptation as we go along. And that is one of its biggest strengths and its biggest weaknesses, in that we're not exactly sure how to deal with all of these challenges. I would say, top of my mind is that there's a bit of a disconnect between what people expect and want digital platforms to do and what legislation can actually require. There is still a huge zone of discretion that platforms have to interpret, have to determine their own, or undertake their own risk assessment processes, develop their own solutions. It's not that prescriptive into actually dealing with the sort of everyday harms, as opposed to like the really pointed harms, like image-based sexual abuse was one of the things that was mentioned, is something you can deal with clearly in law. Dealing with bullying, dealing with the broader category of content, discrimination and bias, those are things that we still don't actually know exactly what we want from platforms in a way that still has to be developed.
Yeah. I would add, there's various things. We'll talk about the size and complexity of the bill, or act as it is now. I think, to your point, exactly, it's very complicated. So to give you an idea, we've got around 40 different policy products that we've got to produce, codes of practice, guidance, all these sorts of things. It's hugely complex to make sure that they all interact correctly together, and that's why I was setting out the first question. We're not going to get it right first time, and it's going to be making sure that we are being fair across large and small platforms as well, and expectation levels. But when you were talking about that, it's expectation management as well. I think there's a lot of people thinking that this is going to be the instant solution, as I was saying, about solving these problems, and it's not going to be the case, and there are still going to be harms online. And there are still going to be people that can circumvent anything a platform does to try and do it. I've worked in this field for 30 years in abuse departments, as they were, and then in trust and safety. And I've probably seen just about every effort, and I think David pointed out, it's just unintended consequences as well of what people do. They don't realise, they don't necessarily think, they're thinking the altruistic reasons, I can connect people, it'd be a really cool thing to put on my platform. But what actually are the unintended consequences?
Yeah, I think sort of connected to what the previous few panelists have said in terms of the size, I think one of the real challenges, and so many of the specific ways that I think the legislation will be difficult to implement in practice, is the sheer scale of types of harm that companies need to consider. And it's actually even a smaller category than the government's first conceptualization, which included sort of things that were harmful but not illegal for adults to see or experience. So you have an online platform now that now has to go through, using a single regulatory framework to think about everything from bullying between children to terrorist extremist content and incitement to terrorist actions, to dealing with the proceeds of fraud, to unregulated company activities, to every sort of ill in society is somehow, well, not every, but a large number of them are inside this legislation. And I think, to kind of reflect what I think Elizabeth was saying earlier, is that we shouldn't make such clear distinctions between the online and the offline world. We wouldn't have an offline safety act which tried to, in a single framework, deal with every single kinetic physical harm that existed in society. We deal with them through very specific, targeted approaches, and I think potentially reflecting the government's ambition to sort of deal with a large number of problems that people raised about different platforms. The legislation is trying to deal with almost all of them in for the most part, a single regulatory framework. And I think that's where there's going to be some real challenges, I think, both in terms of Ofcom's role of trying to guide companies to do it, but companies themselves in complying with whatever Ofcom recommends for them.
Okay. One of the first big challenges of the Online Safety Act in 2024 will be disinformation, which is one of the big drivers of the political discussions around regulating social media platforms. And in 2024, there'll be so many significant elections taking place across the world. I'm going to start with Fred, but feel free to chip in if you've got other comments. What can we expect to see with regards to disinformation and the role of Ofcom in implementing the Online Safety Act?
This is an interesting question because we don't actually necessarily have everything in place already. We don't have all the evidence base. We've been listening, obviously, to what Andy and others were saying as well about understanding what is that impact, what is the actual risk of harm according to this misinformation. And also, to again go back to Elizabeth about what are we doing about media literacy? What are we doing about making people critically think about what they're seeing and what are the business models going on behind it? So I mean, I can talk about thought processes, but not what we're definitely going to be doing. But the sort of
will the advisory committee on disinformation be up next year?
Potentially. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, like I say, so I can't necessarily say it's definitely going to be in by X date. But that's one of the sort of areas that we're looking at. Can we have an advisory board to help us with these sorts of things? And how can we work with academia to understand more about what that impact is and what is the risk? Where does the risk sit? And then be able to work with the platforms. I mean, we are a regulator, but it doesn't mean we're just going to be calling people in and telling them that they're doing everything wrong. It's very much about understanding what are you already doing? How effective are the solutions you've got in place? Are you trying to recognise it's by using technology? I'm a technologist, so I'm thinking about, okay, how can you recognise the patterns of behaviour, the sorts of ways that people are interacting with each other, the networks, all the sorts of things that David was talking about that CRISP do as well, and identifying where are those threats coming from, so we can actually try and target a specific area to make a biggest impact, because we're not going to be able to stop all mis and disinformation online. And it's also to think about the value chain of dis and misinformation. So is somebody producing something that might be considered misinformation, it's just got something slightly wrong on a platform, and then somebody else has taken that and put it on another platform and added their comment on top of it, which is their own motivation to either draw in more numbers so they can get more revenue from ads and all these sorts of things. So we have to think about the full value chain before we can make a call on whether or not it's just that case.
And Nicholas, Oversight Board, are you thinking about well, I'm sure you're thinking about the next year, but what can we expect to see from Meta and the Oversight Board itself?
Yeah, so I can't talk for Meta, but there are, 75 or so major elections coming up next year. More than 2/3 of the world's population are going to the polls. It's going to be an interesting time, and it's not as if any of the major social platforms can even pretend that they will be caught unawares by the sorts of risks that we're talking about, right? We have been dealing with this at the very least since 2016, much earlier than that in other ways, that the elections have become crisis points around social media. We have seen, so from the Oversight Board perspective, we're really concerned about elections where the governments have been actively suppressing speech, actively spreading hate speech. We rendered a decision about Cambodia just before the Cambodian election this year, where Prime Minister Hun Sen was encouraging people to take baseball bats to the opposition candidates' houses. There's out and out, not hard to detect hate speech, not hard to draw the line misinformation or caricature or false information, but out and out attempts to manipulate the electoral system. President Trump, we obviously, one of the first things we did as the Oversight Board, one of the first decisions we released was about the suspension of President Trump in the US over quite misleading claims about how the election was stolen and inflaming people to storm the Capitol on January 6th, right? So we talk I think there's a danger of getting caught up, as I think the earlier panel said, in the sort of new harms. Everyone's worried right now about generative AI and what generative deepfakes are going to do. I'm terrified about what repressive regimes are going to do and how they are influencing both social media companies and traditional media in a way that attempts to restrict freedom of speech and restrict the ability of people to make an informed decision. But I also really wanted to throw it back to you, because I hear you have lots of things to tell us about disinformation and elections. Can I ask you the same question?
Well, I did produce some disinformation actually myself a few years ago. If you Google Johnson Corbyn deepfake, you'll see some of my previous work. That was released during the 2019 general election, and also the Royal Society has a report called The Online Information Environment, which does look at this challenge of disinformation. I'm going to move us on to a different question, just conscious of time, and we'll start with Richard. So the Online Safety Act, as we've heard, was primarily put forward to protect children from harm. High up the list of parents' concerns at the moment is the impact of the controversial influencer Andrew Tate, who is said to have promoted dangerous misogynistic ideas amongst young boys and men, leading to deeply sexist attitudes and behaviours. And previous attempts to temper his influence have been reversed, and he was recently let back onto Twitter, now X. What tangible impact, if any, do you think the Online Safety Act will have with regards to his influence on young people, and what should platforms be doing, if anything?
I think well, Fred will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the features of the Online Safety Act, which I think is commendable, is that it doesn't require Ofcom to investigate individual pieces of content, or possibly even individual accounts. It's looking at the broad systems and processes that companies do or don't have in place to mitigate the identified harms from their risk assessments. I think that's a fair, an okay-ish summary. So I think it's going to be a challenge where you have a very high-profile piece of content or user or account holder for a regulatory body to take action against that company because of that one account or because of that one piece of content, if the systems that underpin it are broadly in line with what the expectations are. If, for example, you have a situation where Andrew Tate is using a platform and that is symptomatic of a company's complete lax policy over any content moderation whatsoever, including content which is objectively harmful, then I think that's where the regulator will come in. But I think it really poses challenges, and we saw this a lot around the decisions relating to President Trump, about when you have a platform which has a content moderation processes in place, but you have a very high profile, potentially political or public figure who is crossing the line. And the question around, well, do you treat them differently, or how do you treat the sort of the potential benefits of exposing this person for the ridiculous things that they might be saying? I think one complicating factor, and I kind of want to come back to something that Andrew was saying, because I think it connects to Andrew Tate as well as a lot of these issues, is there's, I think, an instinctive revulsion against the kind of things that he says. But what I don't know if we have is there objective evidence which demonstrates that people are behaving differently or are objectively harmed as a result, beyond being offended or disliking or strongly disagreeing with what he says? And I think that evidence base of what influence is this particular content or user having on people is really difficult to measure. But it's something that I think needs to be there before you're going to have regulatory intervention.
There was a big campaign in the drafting of the bill to have women and girls named in the Act itself as a vulnerable group. Fred, do you have any thoughts on whether people's expectations of the bill taking action on misogynistic content online will actually result in any meaningful change?
Well, we all love talking about everyone's favourite influencer, Andrew Tate, and Rich is absolutely right. I see the content itself is the symptom. And actually, the Act is targeting at the systems and processes. So it will depend on which platform they're on, who's actually consuming, who's got access to that platform, and what age are they? Because I understand that Andrew Tate is particularly well watched or listened or whatever it is between 13 and 21-year-old boys, which is a worrying thing. But actually, if you start then digging into that a little bit and start saying, okay, what are the terms and conditions? Who's using this site? What are the risks associated with that site? It may be that one site you say, absolutely, you're failing the regulation here because you're serving this terrible content up to children. It may be on another side you're saying, well, actually, this is an adult-only site, and the adults can make their call, and it is objectionable, but it's actually not illegal what he's saying. So in that case, you would say, well, there's nothing that the regulators should do in that space. So it will be, or limited action. So I would say that it's going to be nuanced. It depends on the particular platform and what the risk is to the users of that platform.
Nicholas.
And so here we get to the gap that I was mentioning at the start, where if it doesn't quite cross the line, we might say there's not really a role for a public regulator to play. I'm not sure that's good enough for the platforms, right? Because what we're missing here is just how systemically entrenched the ecosystem that supports influencers like Tate and others is amongst the platform. And it's really complex, right? Well, in some ways it's really complex. In other ways it's really simple. There are ads that are sold based on how many people view content, and there is traffic that is driven from controversial content, from smaller players all up to bigger players. There is a symbiotic relationship between the platforms, the small influencers, and the big mainstream media channels, where you exchange viewers and you grow audiences for really controversial content. What do you want to do about that? The law isn't in a position to tell us. This is where we really need a bigger discussion of when you're talking about the cumulative harm of ordinary, everyday misogyny, not one bit of which you can definitively say turn someone into a bad person or actually hurt someone, but in aggregate, we think has serious impact, then we're out of the realm of really of old regulatory tools. The exciting kind of bit about the regulation that we're talking about is it doesn't focus on content, and it does allow us to do bigger risk assessments. But the challenge is we don't know how to do them. We don't know exactly what we want from the platforms. We don't know how willing we are to dig into the business models, to dig into the relationships that support the sort of content that we're talking about. And when we're going to allow people, when we think it's important to protect freedom of expression, to allow people to say what they say, and when we're going to start drawing those lines. That's a big social conversation that is still yet to happen.
I'm going to do one final question, and also to mention that Ofcom is actually running a consultation at the moment. And Fred, next time you speak, if you could share a bit more details on that, that'd be great. So the final question is, there are concerns that the Online Safety Act will violate the privacy rights of internet users, particularly in relation to encrypted messaging. The president of Signal, the messaging app, Meredith Whittaker, had warned that requirements around client-side scanning before messages were sent would undermine the principle of end-to-end encryption. Do the panelists agree that this is a challenge, or can they clarify what the Act will do in practice? Let's start this way.
I'm not going to try and clarify what the Act is going to do in practice. I think I will defer to Fred on this, but I also think that the government has kept the legislation a little bit ambiguous in terms of it hasn't prohibited encryption, but at the same time it's indicated that having entirely private messages does not remove you from any of the regulatory expectations as well, which is going to be a challenge for a platform that uses end-to-end encryption. I think my perspective on this is that it's really worrying if we start to see efforts made to chip away at the benefits that end-to-end encryption provides. In the offline world, yes, we can have targeted interception of individual letters, individual properties, individual communications to an extent. You can't just remove end-to-end encryption for one set of communications or for one particular user. It undermines the entire security, not just of the communications between people who might be in the UK, where the Online Safety Act applies, but also people in other parts of the world who may be at far greater risk, but who are communicating via end-to-end encryption with the UK. And I do empathise with security and law enforcement agencies that see this kind of black hole of activity that they want to get access to, and their instinct is to kind of get rid of the barriers and the locks and the restrictions that prevent them from accessing what may well be illegal, harmful, dangerous activity. But there are so many dangers that come from weakening end-to-end encryption, because you can't just weaken it a little bit or weaken it for some people once you start to chip it away and everyone becomes vulnerable. And so this is why I'm reassured that we have real technology experts at Ofcom who understand this, perhaps a little bit more than some of the policymakers in government and the politicians who are driven by public pressure or pressure from law enforcement agencies but don't quite understand the tech. So I am more confident that Ofcom is now sort of looking over this than perhaps when parliamentarians were. But I would say it's pretty vital that we don't undermine encryption.
Fred?
It's a $64,000 question, isn't it, really? I mean, and this is an interesting one, and Richard's right, there's been ambiguity built into this, which, and you may have heard that there's been a point around, it's got to be technically feasible and proportionate. Now, so when you start talking about what does proportionality mean, I mean, technically feasible, you can talk around when encryption is encryption, full stop. Where does the end begin and end? Who's controlling that end, beginning and end? And are they able to actually take action in between? Is it truly app-to-app, end-to-end encrypted? Some are, some aren't. And there's a huge amount you can do as well. For those that don't know, graph theory, look it up. It's fascinating. Lots of social media companies are absolutely on top of this. And it's something that doesn't seem to feature in the debate, which I always find quite fascinating, because you can start using graph theory to see who's communicating with who, when, building up quite an in-depth picture if you've got a large platform already. So there are things you can do that don't involve having to break into encryption. I think the client-side element of it at the moment is a bit of a red herring, to be honest with you, because Ofcom does not have any regulatory powers in operating systems on end devices. So when people keep saying you're going to mandate out that platforms must client-side scan, now we've seen things that have taken place, people have tried different things, and there are certain things that could be done. Some platforms deploy nudity filters and all sorts of other things that can limit the risks associated with things on the device. So they're putting these in the apps and using the device's processing power and operating systems. But the challenge around users' privacy, actually, I mean, a lot of that is around the Information Commissioner. So we do have to work very closely as a regulator to say, well, actually, this sits in your bailiwick, this is your area, but actually, we don't want to be able to say something that's going to impact on somebody's data protection. So there's lots of communication going on between the regulators as well.
Encrypted, I hope.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, good.
Can you say a little bit about the consultation?
Yes, sorry, a shameless plug. So we have a couple of consultations out. One's on the illegal harms consultation. Please do comment on it. It's on the Ofcom website. And we've just released also some more consultations around what we call Part 5, age assurance. What that means is the age assurance process is to try and prevent children from seeing manifestly adult websites, so sites that are just providing and filming themselves, and we're not talking about user-generated content, adult sites, we're talking about the bigger ones. But love to get everybody's view. The more consultation, Ofcom is all about consulting and get everybody's view. So we'd like to get the consultations in rather than hear about it on social media when somebody hasn't responded to a consultation.
Nicholas, your thoughts on the encryption question?
Yeah, I find myself so conflicted on encryption at the moment. I've spent my career complaining about companies like Facebook and how large they are and how the monopolies are inherently dangerous for consumers. I've also spent a lot of time talking about the benefits of encrypted services for ordinary safety, for people to communicate, for people to live their lives. What really worries me right now is there's so much talk about decentralization and interoperability. So at the same time that this conversation is happening in Europe under the Digital Markets Act, we're talking about mandated connection between different instant messaging networks, which either entails breaking end-to-end encryption or finding some other way to allow encrypted messages from random, unmoderated, smaller platforms that don't do all of the things that you're talking about for safety monitoring into the much more protected ecosystems of the large players. I don't like the large players, but I'm also terrified by all of the work that has to go into doing trust and safety not being done in a fully decentralized environment. I think that's incredibly challenging, and I don't have a good answer.
Okay, that was a whirlwind 25 minutes, and can we just have a massive round of applause for our excellent panel?